Snow clung to the narrow ridge road like a thin veil of hesitation, and Caleb Hensley felt every inch of it beneath his worn boots. The early winter storm had blown in quicker than any forecast, carrying a wind shift that scraped against the wide curved path leading toward his workshop, a path he once walked with confidence, direction, and long-term vision. But tonight, the air tasted different. There was a tension in it, quiet, heavy, and sharp at the edges. Even his old shepherd dog, Birch, moved with uneasy steps, nose low, body rigid, ears pricked as though the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Animals sensed danger long before men admitted something was wrong. The workshop door, usually steady as a single strong fence line, hung crooked on one hinge. Splintered wood lay scattered like broken trust across the porch. Caleb froze, heart tightening, focus narrowing. This was no accident. No wind had done this, no storm had carved deliberate marks into the lock. Inside, lantern light flickered over empty shelves, tools gone, drawers stripped, patterns stolen, a lifetime of stewardship, discipline, and craft scattered like dust in winter drafts. He stepped deeper into the silence, feeling the weight of betrayal press against him with the cold. Snow drifted through the broken window, landing on his workbench, the one he had built with Jonah the summer the boy turned 12. A single flake melted on the smooth oak surface, leaving a bead of water that glimmered like a small, painful truth. Someone he trusted had done this. Caleb rested his trembling hands on the bench, trying to gather clarity, direction, some anchor for the storm rising inside him. But purpose slipped away like heat from an open door. But it didn't start there. We must go back a little in time. If this opening moved something quiet within you, subscribe now, so you never miss another story that strengthens purpose, restores clarity, and brings your heart back to God's timing. Long before snow covered the ridge, and long before betrayal slipped into Caleb's life, like a quiet thief, the valley moved with a gentler rhythm, one shaped by purpose, patient hands, and the steady hum of rural days. Most mornings began before the sun. Caleb would step onto the porch as mist lifted from the holler, unveiling the familiar landscape like clarity returning to a tired mind. The distant hills rolled in soft blues, and the farm trails curved into the woods like a wide path God himself might have traced with intention. Those early hours always reminded him that direction had to be chosen long before the day demanded it. Birch trotted at his side while the roosters announced another chance at intentional living. A man who woke with gratitude, Caleb believed, carried a form of spiritual leadership the valley sorely needed. Steady, quiet, rooted in integrity rather than show. And every morning he whispered a simple prayer as he looked toward the eastern ridge. Help me walk today with clarity and good stewardship. His workshop sat near an old oak tree, massive and unshaken, its branches extending like a long-term vision that only grew stronger with time. Caleb often paused beneath it, touching the bark with a reverence reserved for things that had outlived storms and men alike. That tree had counseled him through seasons of doubt, reminding him, with a silence deeper than words, that stability came from consistent character, not comfort. Inside the workshop, the air always smelled of sawdust and cold iron. Tools hung neatly on the walls, his father's hammer, his grandfather's plane, and a row of chisels sharpened with the discipline of a man who knew that craftsmanship mirrored the condition of the soul. A tool of discipline, whatever form it took, was a teacher more than an object. Caleb's days flowed with purpose. He carved rocking chairs for new mothers, built sturdy tables for families gathering around Christmas, and shaped keepsake boxes meant to hold wedding rings or letters never to be thrown away. Every piece carried a whisper of his long-term vision, work that outlasted him, work that honored God, work that infused the valley with stability in a time when men were losing direction. But it wasn't just furniture he was building. For the past year, He'd been quietly training a younger man from the valley, Evan, a neighbor in his late 20s who had wandered in one autumn asking for part-time work. Evan had grown up rough, without a father to guide him, and Caleb felt an instinctive tug toward mentorship. Something in the young man's eyes carried a need for direction, discipline, and the kind of emotional maturity no school taught. At first, Evan came only twice a week, sweeping sawdust or sanding railings. But over time, Caleb began teaching him the deeper things: how to read the grain of wood, how to protect integrity even when no one watched, how strategic thinking wasn't about cleverness, but about responsibility. Under the oak tree's shadow, Caleb often shared wisdom his own grandfather had gifted him. Leadership begins long before a man is seen leading. Starts in the quiet place where he chooses what kind of man he'll be. Evan listened, sometimes too quietly, sometimes with guarded eyes, but he listened. Meanwhile, the valley prepared for Christmas. The Ridge families gathered pine boughs. The church choir rehearsed hymns, and children practiced lines for the Christmas Eve program. Even the older farmers, wrapped in layers against the cold, spoke of hope for the year ahead. The season carried its own kind of clarity, a reminder that peace wasn't the absence of hardship, but the presence of purpose in the middle of it. Caleb's workshop became a hub of warmth amid the winter chill. People came not just to buy handcrafted gifts, but to seek his insight, ask for guidance, or simply breathe the steady calm that seemed to dwell between the wooden beams. Yet beneath all this tranquility, something subtle had begun to shift, small inconsistencies, barely noticeable. A chisel misplaced, a ledger left open when Caleb knew he had closed it, a delivery log with handwriting that wasn't his. Caleb brushed it off at first, telling himself discipline sometimes slipped when days grew long. But Birch, ever perceptive, had begun to watch Evan differently, ears forward, tail stiff, a low rumble in his chest when the young man approached the workbench after hours. Animals sensed the invisible currents of a man's intention long before the truth surfaced. Still, Caleb extended trust. Trust was, after all, a form of stewardship, and the mountains around him seemed steady enough, the oak tree standing firm, the fence lines holding, the path ahead clear. Nothing yet hinted at the breach approaching, at the fracture in integrity that would soon test his resilience, his focus, and his capacity for forgiveness. For now, the valley was quiet, purpose was strong, and Christmas was drawing near. Caleb's dream had never been grand in the worldly sense, never driven by money or the kind of ambition that rusts a man's integrity. It grew slowly, year by year, like the roots of the old oak tree by his workshop, quiet, deep, shaped by storms as much as by sunlight. It began one autumn morning 3 years earlier. He had been sanding a cradle for a young family when a sunrise spilled gold across the valley, soft and warm, as if God himself lit the ridge to give him renewed purpose. Birch lay at his feet, tail thumping faintly, while the scent of fresh pine rose in the cool air. Caleb paused, breath steadying, and allowed the moment to settle into him. He whispered a quiet prayer, not for success, not for comfort, but for clarity. Lord, show me where this gift of my hands is meant to serve beyond myself. The insight didn't arrive with thunder or miracle. It arrived the way God often worked in the Appalachians, softly, like mist lifting off the river, revealing what had been there all along. Caleb saw, with emotional maturity shaped by years of disciplined living, that woodworking had never been about the furniture. It had been about shaping people, character, focus, long-term direction. A memory surfaced, his grandfather's hands guiding his own, teaching him that stewardship was not ownership, it was responsibility for the next generation. That morning, Caleb envisioned something simple yet profound, a community workshop for boys and young men in the valley, especially those who lacked direction or fathers to steady their steps, a place where they would learn more than bending boards and sharpening chisels, a place where discipline grew naturally, like crops from good soil, where strategic thinking and moral courage became the backbone of adulthood, where resilience was formed not through lectures but through work, sweat, and honest mistakes. He imagined shelves lined with projects representing their growth, uneven at first, then gradually steadier as clarity settled into them. He imagined evenings beneath the lantern light, teaching not only joinery, but the deeper wisdom of consistency. And he imagined them carrying this inner strength into their families someday, becoming leaders the valley could rely on. Mara had been the first person he told. She listened quietly, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of cider, her expression softening with understanding. "Caleb," she said, "this isn't just a dream. This is your calling. It's the kind of purpose that outlives a man." Her discernment had always steadied him. Slowly, he began preparing for it, setting aside a tool here, saving money there, repairing the older benches, sketching designs for a room big enough to hold 10 apprentices. Evan's arrival had felt like divine confirmation, a first test case, perhaps even a blessing pointing toward long-term vision. Caleb had seen potential in him, raw, unsettled, but full of possibility. And so the dream deepened. Some evenings, after the day's work ended, Caleb would sit under the old oak tree, hands resting on his knees, and let the stillness of twilight guide his thoughts. The tree's presence reminded him that transformation required time, patience, and roots anchored in something stronger than personal ambition. He prayed again, not for speed, but for wisdom and discernment, for the strength to guide young men with compassion and firmness, for the emotional maturity to protect boundaries like a single strong fence line, for the courage to pursue long-term purpose even when obstacles rose. He believed this dream would open doors in the valley, the kind of doors money never could. He didn't know then how deeply it would be tested, or how betrayal would strike not at the dream itself, but at the trust required to build it. Winter came early that year, creeping down the ridge with a quiet severity that tested even the seasoned mountain folk. The first hard freeze stiffened the ground until it felt like frozen soil, resistant to every step, as if the earth itself questioned a man's direction. For Caleb, the cold carried something heavier than weather. It mirrored what was happening inside him. Work slowed to a crawl, orders delayed, wood deliveries late. Little things at first, but each inconvenience nudged his discipline, chipped away at his resilience, and left him feeling like a man walking uphill against an unseen pressure. He tried to keep his focus, waking early, sharpening tools, sweeping the floorboards, but even these routines, long anchored by purpose, now felt unsteady. His clarity slipped like frost on winter boards, thin and treacherous. Even birch seemed restless, pacing near the workshop door, nose lifting toward the wind as though it carried warnings Caleb could not yet interpret. One morning, Caleb noticed the rope used for hauling lumber lying stretched across the yard, wet and stiff, as if dragged carelessly and left to freeze. He frowned. Evan had used it the day before. Caleb distinctly remembered reminding him to coil it properly. Missteps happened, but something in the way the rope trailed, haphazard, half buried in snow, felt symbolic, a physical mirror of the internal unraveling he tried hard to ignore. Discipline was no longer enough without direction, and he sensed his long-term vision dimming beneath a fatigue he couldn't name. Inside the workshop, the chill seeped through the boards. The fire took longer to catch, as though even the wood resisted being warmed. Caleb tightened his gloves and worked in silence, but his mind wouldn't be still. He found himself replaying conversations with Evan, tiny moments he'd dismissed, a too casual tone, A drawer opened without permission, a glance lingering on the ledger. None of it outright wrong, but together forming a pattern he was reluctant to see. Betrayal doesn't arrive loudly in the mountains. It arrives quietly, gaining ground the way winter spreads through the hollow, slow, cold, certain. One evening, as dusk settled purple over the ridge, Caleb walked the fence line behind the workshop. The fence had always been a symbol of boundaries, clear, steady, strong. But halfway down the hill he found a section splintered and sagging as though hit or forced aside. Snow piled unevenly around it, hiding footprints. He touched the broken wood, his breath visible in the dimming light, a boundary breached, a warning unspoken. He replaced the post temporarily, but the damage stayed with him long after he returned inside. Integrity, he knew, required consistency. Something in the valley, something in his own heart was beginning to lose that consistency. Mara noticed before he said a word. "You're quieter these days," she murmured over supper, studying his face with that intuitive discernment that had steadied him for years. "I'm just tired," Caleb said, though it wasn't entirely true. Fatigue was part of it, yes, but underneath lived a deeper erosion, an ache shaped by uncertainty. "Your direction feels pulled," she said gently, "like the wind keeps changing on you." He nodded, unable to articulate the full weight pressing against him. Leadership demanded emotional maturity, yet he felt his inner strength thinning like stretched twine. His dream, the workshop for young men, felt simultaneously close and impossibly far. He wondered if he'd misread God's timing, misheard the whisper that once brought such clarity. That night, unable to sleep, he stepped outside. The wind slid across the ridge, cold and sharp, but carrying no answers. He walked toward the old oak tree, needing its stability, its wordless wisdom. The moonlight glinted through bare branches, casting patterns on the snow like veins of an ancient truth. Caleb leaned a hand against the trunk, exhaling slowly. "What am I missing?" he whispered. No voice replied, no miracle unfolded. Only the deep quiet of winter, a silence that pressed against him with both weight and invitation, an invitation to examine the fracture forming inside him. He thought of Evan, of how eagerly the young man had once watched his hands work, how sincerely he'd seemed to want direction. Yet lately Evan's eyes carried a tension, a calculation Caleb couldn't place, as though the boy struggled between gratitude and something darker. Caleb tried to push the thought away, but discernment, God-given and persistent, returned like a lantern flickering in the dark. Something was shifting, something he did not yet understand. Days passed, each one more strained than the last. Evan began arriving late, avoiding eye contact, taking shortcuts that violated the integrity Caleb insisted on. When corrected, he offered quick excuses, thin as winter branches. One afternoon, while sanding a tabletop, Caleb caught Evan slipping a small chisel into his coat. It wasn't expensive, not even new, but it had belonged to Caleb's father. A legacy piece. "Evan," Caleb said quietly, "that one doesn't belong in your pocket." Evan froze, guilt flashing across his face, then quickly hardening into defensiveness. "I was just borrowing it. You weren't using it." The excuse stung, not because of the tool, but because of what it revealed. A man who misused trust long before he broke it. After Evan left that evening, Caleb sat alone on the workbench, shoulders heavy. The storm inside him tightened, swirling with doubt and exhaustion. He felt direction slipping, purpose bending beneath the strain. The dream of mentoring young men felt suddenly fragile. His long-term vision trembled beneath the possibility that he had chosen the wrong apprentice to begin with. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to confront Evan fully. Not yet. Responsibility weighed on him. Compassion tugged at him. The tension between justice and mercy held him in place like frozen soil, gripping the roots of the oak tree. A man could weather many storms, but few tested him like the slow cracking of trust. And the real storm, he sensed, had not yet begun. The week before Christmas arrived with a thin, brittle cold, the kind that made wood crack under pressure and tested the resolve of even the strongest ridgemen. Caleb felt that same tension moving through him, tightening with every sunrise. Something was coming, something he could no longer ignore. Evan's behavior grew stranger each day. He worked quickly, but without respect. He kept his back half-turned, shoulders tight, glancing often toward the ledger and tool wall as though gauging opportunity. Birch avoided him altogether now, hackles rising each time the young man drew near. Still, Caleb hoped, perhaps foolishly, that patience and guidance might salvage something good in him. Leadership, after all, demanded resilience and moral courage, especially when dealing with wounded souls. But even a man of strong purpose must recognize when the line between stewardship and self-deception begins to blur. The escalation began on a Tuesday. First injustice event, the false claim. Caleb had just finished preparing an order for a family in the lower valley when Sheriff Wilkes rode up the hill, horse-snorting clouds into the frigid air. The sheriff dismounted slowly, too slowly, and Caleb's stomach tightened. "Morning, Caleb," Wilkes said, expression unreadable. "Everything all right?" Caleb asked. Wilkes hesitated. "I'm here because Evan filed a statement against you." The words hit like a hammer to the ribs. "A statement for what?" "For withholding his wages," Wilkes answered gently. "He says you've been shorting him for months." Caleb blinked, stunned. "That's not true. I've paid him every week, in cash. He signs the ledger." Wilkes nodded. "I figured, but he says you forged his name, says you're trying to cover it up." Caleb felt the sting, not of accusation, but of betrayal, burrowing deeper. His clarity dimmed beneath the weight of winter doubt. He knew Evan had been drifting morally, but to twist truth into a weapon, that pierced something deeper. "Sheriff, you've known my family for 3 generations. You know my father's handwriting, my grandfather's, mine. I've never cheated a soul." "I know," Wilkes said, "but I still have to write it down and look into it. It's procedure." Caleb swallowed hard. Leadership demanded integrity even when injustice tightened around a man like a snare. He could not let anger cloud his discernment. "You're welcome to come look through the ledger," Caleb said. "Everything's there." Wilkes nodded, relieved. "I'll be back tomorrow." When the sheriff rode away, the ridge fell quiet. Birch pressed against Caleb's leg, sensing the tremor in him. Mara stepped outside, her face tightening as she read the truth in his eyes. "What happened?" "Evan," Caleb whispered, "just accused me of stealing from him." She closed her eyes, grief knitting her brows. "Caleb, that isn't just wrong. That's a wound done with intention." He looked toward the workshop, its windows glowing faintly in the late afternoon light. The place where he had poured decades of discipline and wisdom now sat shadowed by suspicion. Even the old oak tree seemed to brood beneath the winter sky. "How could he twist trust like that?" Caleb murmured. "People without inner strength sometimes use strategy without moral courage," Mara said softly. "But God sees truth clear as daylight." Caleb nodded, but the ache remained. Second injustice event, the theft and the lie. The next day arrived grey and bitter cold. Caleb entered the workshop early, wanting to prepare the ledger for the sheriff, but the moment he stepped inside, he stopped dead. Drawers hung open, boxes overturned. The cabinet containing specialty tools, family heirlooms, gaped empty. Fresh boot prints marred the sawdust-covered floor. His heart sank like a plow hitting stone. He followed the prints to the back door, wide open, snow blowing in. And on the floor, half buried in frost, lay a familiar object. Evan's work gloves. A man's hands tell truth, a man's gloves tell the rest. Caleb steadied himself, No storm outside was more fierce than the storm building within, testing his discipline, his wisdom, his ability to walk with integrity when wronged. Mara found him standing in the doorway, shoulders heavy. "He stole from you," she whispered. "He stole from this place," Caleb corrected quietly, "from what it stands for." When Sheriff Wilkes returned later that morning, Evan came with him. The young man stood with crossed arms, jaw tight, eyes dark with defiance, or fear disguised as defiance. "Caleb," Wilkes said, "Evan claims you broke into his cabin last night." Caleb stared, stunned. What?" Evan stepped forward, voice sharp. "You went through my things. You planted those gloves to blame me. You know I need the tools more than you. You're just trying to ruin me so nobody hires me again." The accusation sliced deeper than the theft. It revealed the full extent of Evan's manipulation, strategic, calculated, meant to fracture Caleb's integrity in the eyes of the community. But Caleb, though shaken, refused to let anger dictate his words. "Evan," he said quietly, "why are you doing this? I've given you work, guidance, trust." "You didn't give me enough," Evan snapped. There it was, the root of corrosion, the hunger for more without the discipline to earn it. The craving for shortcuts rather than stewardship. Wilkes raised a hand. "Enough, I'm going to investigate. But Caleb, until this is sorted, folks are going to be talking." Caleb nodded slowly. He could withstand public suspicion. But what weighed heavier was the realization that his mentorship, his dream of shaping young men with purpose, had been twisted into an opportunity for exploitation. After Wilkes led Evan away, Caleb stepped outside, bracing against the harsh wind. The ridge looked unfamiliar, stripped of its usual serenity. Even the mountain horizon felt distant, muted, hiding its glow. His long-term vision, once bright as a lantern, now flickered beneath the cold breath of injustice. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not for vindication, but for discernment. "Lord, give me the strength to walk upright when shadows fall. Give me wisdom to see what you are doing beneath what I cannot understand." For the first time in years, he felt as though the fence lines of his life, his boundaries, his clarity, his trust had been broken in more than one place. And the storm was not finished with him. Not yet. Evan's collapse did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived the way winter rot spreads through a weakened fence post. Quiet, inevitable, the natural consequence of choices repeated until they hollow a man out. 3 days after the sheriff's visit, word spread through the valley that a local merchant in the lower town, Mr. Hargreaves, known for keeping meticulous records, had reported missing tools from his storeroom. Not just missing, but traced. The merchant had ordered special marking for his inventory, tiny etchings near the metal joints. When buyers unknowingly purchased the stolen items at a roadside exchange, he recognized them instantly. And the seller, someone matching Evan's description. Sheriff Wilkes rode out to question him, but Evan panicked. Instead of facing the inquiry with honesty, he fled into the wooded ridge, hoping the mountain's shadows could cover what integrity refused to defend. But the Appalachians have a way of revealing truth. God's country does not shelter deceit. A cold rain fell that afternoon, turning soil slick and heavy. Evan tried crossing the old footbridge near Miller's Creek, but the boards, aged and softened by storms, gave beneath his weight. He slipped, not far, not dangerously, but enough to twist his ankle and leave him stranded on the embankment, soaked, shivering, and stripped of his bravado. A hunter found him near dusk, curled beside a fallen pine, clutching the stolen tools he hadn't managed to hide. When Wilkes arrived, Evan no longer carried the sharp defiance that once fueled his accusations. His eyes held something different now. Fear, yes, but also the dawning understanding that his strategy had eaten away at the very stability he longed for. Cleverness had brought him here. Character could have carried him farther. In the sheriff's office, the truth unraveled cleanly. Receipts, etched markings, witnesses. Evan's story collapsed under the weight of evidence. When he finally admitted to the false accusations against Caleb, his voice was small, brittle, like a branch that had weathered too many storms. Wilkes came to the Hensley homestead that evening, lantern in hand. Caleb stood on the porch, Birch beside him, watching the sheriff's silhouette emerge through the mist-like dusk rising from the valley floor. "It's over," Wilkes said. "The boy confessed. Everything, you're cleared." Caleb nodded, relief quiet but steady. He had no desire for triumph, only truth. Integrity did not seek applause. It simply needed space to breathe again. Mara stepped beside him, laying a hand on his arm. Her expression held that soft, spiritual maturity Caleb had leaned on through the worst of it. "What will happen to Evan?" she asked. Wilkes sighed. "The court will handle the charges, but he's broken inside more than outside. He'll need guidance someday, if he's willing. Right now, he's just a young man who ran from responsibility until it caught him." Caleb looked toward the distant ridge where the fallen footbridge lay, the mountains rolling dark beneath the fading light. He felt no anger, only a somber ache for what could have been. Potential squandered, a path chosen without direction, a life that had sought shortcuts instead of stewardship. "Character outlasts cleverness," Caleb murmured. Wilkes removed his hat. "It always does." When the sheriff left, the valley settled into an evening stillness. The old oak tree stood unwavering in the yard, as though guarding the truth that had finally surfaced. The workshop windows glowed warm again, untouched by fear or accusation. Yet Caleb felt something unexpected rising within him, not bitterness, not triumph, but a quiet, humbled gratitude. God's timing had allowed the truth to surface without Caleb lifting a single vengeful hand. No retaliation, no shouting, no bending of his own integrity. The unjust had fallen by their own choices, and the man who held to righteousness, though shaken, remained standing. The ridge exhaled with him, a breath of slow restoration. The storm that had settled over Caleb's spirit for weeks began to loosen its grip the morning after Wilkes cleared his name. Not by dramatic announcement, not by sudden joy, but by something quieter, almost imperceptible at first. It started with Birch. The old shepherd dog had grown tense during the weeks of conflict, pacing at night, growling at shadows, sensing the spiritual weight that hung over the homestead. But that morning, as Caleb stepped onto the porch, Birch trotted forward with a gentle ease, tail sweeping the air like a soft brushstroke of reassurance. His eyes carried none of the strain of recent days, only peace, the kind animals show when danger has passed. The valley was washed clean by the night's rain. Puddles reflected the sky, still water shimmering with the kind of spiritual peace only God can send after long testing. A few rays of early light reached over the ridge, touching the barns, the fence lines, the workshop roof, as if blessing each piece of the land Caleb had stewarded with such consistency. He walked the familiar, wide-curved path toward the workshop, feeling each step return a measure of strength he thought he'd lost. The air held that unmistakable freshness, the scent of an ending storm and a beginning season. When he reached the door, he paused, listening, silence, but not the heavy kind, the healing kind. Inside, he rekindled the stove, the flame catching easily this time, eager as a promise. He sat on the workbench, letting warmth seep into his hands, feeling clarity rise in him as slowly and steadily as dawn. Then something shifted, the wind itself. A wind shift, subtle but undeniable, swept down from the ridge, brushing through the cracks of the workshop walls. It carried no chill, only direction, the kind a man feels rather than hears, the kind that signals divine guidance. Caleb stepped outside again, drawn without understanding why. The sky had changed. Clouds parted in a slow, reverent motion, and the first full sweep of sunlight broke across the mountaintops. It wasn't ordinary light, it was a golden horizon, glowing like a promise kept after a long wait. And in that light, the oak tree, standing tall and unbroken, seemed to lean into the sunrise, as though God himself had placed his hand over that piece of ground. Caleb felt his throat tighten, but not from sorrow, from recognition. Insight arrived in the silence, gentle and unforced. This trial hadn't been about the workshop or the tools or even Evan. It had been about strengthening Caleb's character before expanding his purpose, about teaching him that leadership does not deepen in seasons of ease, but in seasons where integrity costs more than convenience. The betrayal that had wounded him had also cleared the path ahead, sharpened his vision, humbled his heart, and prepared him for the long-term purpose he still carried. He closed his eyes, whispering, "Lord, thank you. I see it now." For the first time in weeks, his prayer held no tremor of uncertainty, only gratitude. Mara stepped beside him then, having followed quietly, drawn by the same mysterious pull. Her breath caught at the sight of the glowing horizon. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "It's more than that," Caleb said softly. "It's direction." She studied him, eyes warming with relief. "Your clarity is back." He nodded, emotion rising with a strength that surprised him. "God's timing." He paused, voice thickened by reverence. "God never arrives late." Mara smiled, tears forming. "Never." They walked together toward the workshop, and Caleb felt a restored vision unfolding within him, stronger, steadier, wiser than before. His dream of the community workshop no longer felt fragile, it felt ordained. He would build it, not just as a place for skills, but as a haven for transformation, for young men who needed boundaries like strong fence lines and purpose like steady oak roots. And he would build it with leadership tempered by suffering, fortified by discernment, and renewed by grace. The storm had ended. The peace that followed was not the absence of hardship, but the presence of divine assurance. As he stood beneath the oak tree, the golden light warming its bark, Caleb felt inner strength settle deep into him, a resilience born from trial, a direction shaped by God's quiet hand. And somewhere in the valley, far from his sight, Evan, broken, humbled, and facing the consequences of his actions, began his own slow journey toward repentance. The fall of the unjust had not been Caleb's doing. It had been the natural collapse of choices built on unstable soil. But even that, Caleb believed God could redeem in time. For now, the ridge breathed peace. The wind carried blessing, and the horizon glowed with promise. In the weeks that followed, Caleb carried himself with a steadier stride, the kind that comes only after a man has walked through a storm and discovered God waiting on the other side. The workshop grew warm again with purpose. The oak tree stood like a sentinel of legacy, and the ridge seemed to breathe a deeper peace each morning. As word of the truth spread through the valley, neighbors offered encouragement, but Caleb asked for none. His heart had already settled into a simple, enduring insight. It is better to lose comfort than compromise integrity. Leadership, he realized, begins not with strength, but with humility, the kind that bends without breaking, trusts without seeing, and stands firm when falsehoods swirl like winter winds. In quiet evenings, he would sit by the fence line he'd repaired, watching birch rest calmly at his feet, and reflect on all he had learned. And over time, those reflections distilled into truths he knew he would one day pass on to the young men who entered his workshop. Those who plant in faith harvest clarity. Character outlasts cleverness, and often God strengthens a man before he blesses him. These were not just words, they were the backbone of the man Caleb had become. If Caleb's journey reminded you that integrity still matters, that humility opens doors money can't touch, and that God strengthens a person long before he blesses them, then don't let this be the last story you hear today. Subscribe now so these lessons of purpose, clarity, and resilience keep shaping your days, one story at a time. Every week, new chapters arrive to steady your spirit and sharpen your direction. And if you're ready to go deeper, ready to see how God's timing unfolds in the lives of others walking their own wide, curved paths, then the next video on your screen is waiting for you. It carries the same quiet strength, the same wisdom, and a breakthrough you may need more than you realize right now. Go ahead, step into the next story.